Let's talk about Nintendo Switch 2 versus Steam Deck handheld performance. Now, typically, we carry out performance analysis by using the video outputs of each system, and this in turn presents a challenge, right? It's easy to capture the Steam Deck's output at either 60 or 120 Hz, as I've just demonstrated. However, Switch 2 has no video output in handheld mode, so how do you test performance? Carey from the Forks did things the super hard way by manually counting frames from a high-speed camera feed, so maximum respect for that. My approach? Different. I stuck to the 30 FPS quality handheld mode and used the Switch 2's internal capture system. This gives us a 1080p capture, but only at 30 frames per second, so half temporal resolution. However, the capped frame rate of the game matches the frame rate of the capture. Think of this as a temporary placeholder solution for measuring performance. It's not as precise as I'd like, but measuring this will highlight performance drops and a decent level of accuracy. Steam Deck, well, put it through the same frame rate decimation and we have the same temporal resolution sampling. Beyond that, what we need to remember from these comparisons is that once again, head-to-heads, exact head-to-heads aren't possible. Settings can't be matched, only approximated. We don't have DLSS on deck, nor can we set an 810p output resolution to match what Switch 2 is doing in quality mode. Best we can do is to use FSR3 with a 900p output resolution and a 50 to 90% dynamic resolution range to give us the same 450p to 810p DRS window. Kicking off with CDPR's streaming run in the Kabuki area of Night City, we kick off with like-for-like results with just a small level of instability on the Switch 2 side. The climax of this run sees further instability from the target frame rate, but interestingly, deck is more stable unless collision detection registers a hit. Then the deck seems to momentarily lose its 30 FPS lock. Suggests a CPU advantage for the Steam Deck. But the elephant in the room here is power draw. Steam Deck OLED is still maxing out at around 24.5 watts on average, based on its own internal power meters. But Switch 2 is delivering remarkably similar results, just a little less stable. And it draws around 8.9 watts on average, based on overall battery life. And it has DLSS, of course, so image quality is cleaner. Like-for-like pixel counts, well, that's tricky owing to the compromised nature of Nintendo's internal capture system. Even so, I'd argue in this as close to like-for-like scenario as we can get, for Switch 2 to be doing what it's doing using just 36% of the power used by the Steam Deck, that's astonishing. Moving on to the Beast in Me City Center test. This is a much more demanding test with far more drops under 30 frames per second. Although we can match up the runs here thanks to the CDPR benchmarks, what actually happens within them is dynamic. The more interactions with other racers, the higher the likelihood of a drop beneath 30 FPS. Switch 2 caps at 30 FPS of course, but it can drop to as low as 23 FPS, while deck is undoubtedly smoother with fewer frame rate drops and only dipping into the late 20s. Now Switch 2 of course still has a huge efficiency advantage, plus the image quality benefits of superior upscaling via DLSS. So let's address the next elephant that's in close proximity, that gigantic power efficiency advantage enjoyed by Switch 2. By using the internal power metering offered by Steam Deck, I found that dropping TDP down to 5 watts versus the standard 15 watts gives us a much closer like-for-like test up against Switch 2 in terms of power draw. The effect on performance is devastating on Steam Deck, however, dropping frame rates in this test down to 9.2 frames per second against Switch 2 with its 23 to 30 FPS window. The effect is so devastating on the deck that it's actually running in slow motion. With a similar power draw, Switch 2 simply streets ahead. Going back to Kabuki, average frame rate on deck rises to 13 frames per second, but of course Switch 2 is running this content mostly locked at 30 frames per second with a big resolution advantage. Thing is, it's okay for Steam Deck OLED to use a lot more power because its battery is much larger, 50 watt hours versus Switch 2's 19.75 watt-hours. And as demonstrated earlier, we're sapping a lot of performance from the deck by using an upscaler we don't need, because Steam Deck doesn't have a 1080p screen. For the purposes of our capture, I then re-ran these benchmarks at native 720p, a much better fit for the deck's screen. 800p external capture is a little bit trickier. And as the larger battery accommodates the much higher power draw pretty much, I ran at full TDP, 15 watts. Going back to the Kabuki run, performance is generally smoother than Switch 2 now, though there are still some blips beneath target frame rate. Same situation in the Beast in Me City Centre side mission test. Still some fluctuations under 30 frames per second, but the deck is a touch more stable overall. Both runs are the same or better than they were when we were using the arguably unnecessary upscaler, and it's a better fit for the deck's use case. It's not a 1080p machine, plain and simple, but the fact is that in these test sequences at least, native 720p is actually fine in performance terms. In this test content at least.